do you think, Morgan? Is this political correctness gone too far?
Yeah. I mean, we have a tendency to do that anyway. I mean, you get politically correct. Stuff happens that you don't want to happen. I all of a sudden became an African. Political correctness, African American. I'm not African. An American. I'm not African. An American. I'm not African.
Well, anyway, yeah, but it appears as though that, like, you know, upon European contact, you know, between 1670, even earlier than 1670, to be honest, 1670 and 1717 was when the peak of the trade occurred. That the Eastern Native Americans and also the Midwestern Native Americans got caught up in somewhat of a rat race, an unusual, crazy rat race of trying to, like, you know, access European goods at the expense of selling war captives, and you know, they weren't just simply making war upon people, I mean, because they had some type of vendetta against them most often, but these Native Americans got in almost a type of what I call a crazed, like, frenzy of, like, you know, purposely selling other Native American groups as slaves, and there were particular ethnic groups even more so guilty, such as the Creek and the Chickasaw and the Westo. And what's interesting, what happened with the Westo, what tripped me out with the Westo, these people came down from Virginia, settled in South Carolina, in the southern portion of South Carolina, and they were heavily armed by the English and sold tons of other Native Americans. But when a war occurred between them and Euro Americans, the Euro Americans, or just say plain old white Americans, sold the entire remnant of the tribe to the West Indies. You know, the entire eastern half of the United States and a portion of the Midwestern half of the United States, it became like crazy. It became like a crazy rat race between 1670 and 1717. Of Native Americans selling Native Americans, and now Native Americans weren't only selling Native Americans, there were Europeans also targeting Native American groups. Don't get me wrong, they definitely also were. But but it became a crazy rat race. And you know, what's quite interesting is that, like, a large portion of these people were sold to the West Indies. So a large portion of these people were sold to the West Indies. And I mentioned earlier that the peak of the trade occurred between 1670 and 1717. So if the peak of the trade occurred between 1670 and 1717 and declined steeply after that, and especially after 1730, you can imagine that, like, if an Afro-American has Native American ancestry, it will be kind of far back. And the average Afro-American that has Native American ancestry probably can trace it back to an ancestor who lived throughout the 1700s, sometime through the 1700s, and you know, lesser in the early 1800s. And also you have to consider the fact that more than half of these people were sold to the West Indies and also to New England. and New England had a much smaller Afro-American population than the upper and the deep South. The upper and the deep South were the locations where the Afro-American populations were most dense in particular. Anyway, yeah. But in reference to evidence of Native Americans and Afro-Americans mixing, often in planter wills, you'll find like distinctions between slaves that are they'll say Native American, not Native American, they'll say Indian. I'm thinking in my modern terms, I'm seeing Indian across my face, but Native American is coming out of my mouth. They'll have like Indian, they'll have like Negro, they'll have mulatto, which is half white, half Afro-American, and they'll have Mestiz. And Mestiz is half Afro-American and half Native American. And when indentured servants were the thing, they'll actually have white. Anyway, yeah, you'll see these in planters' wills. Apart from planters' wills, you'll also see ads. Ads of slaves that were Mestiz. It's spelled M-E-S-T-E-E, and also sometimes it's musty, and it's spelled M-U-S-T-E-E. You'll find ads. There were ads about like Native American runaways, and also Native American. Apart from Native American runaways, the Mestiz in Boston, in not Boston particularly, but I meant Massachusetts. Should look at my notes. Massachusetts, as late as 1750. Yeah. Well, anyway, also what's kind of interesting, going back on topic of the Central American and South American and Caribbean DNA, Caribbean native DNA that has been found in Afro-Americans, quite often. What's quite interesting, I've come across several articles that talk about like Mayan DNA being heavily found in the Creek peoples. The Creek peoples, what's interesting, the Creek peoples were highly involved in selling other Native American groups, but at the decline of the Native American slave trade, the Creek, the Chickasaw, and the Cherokee, I hope I didn't forget earlier, while I'm mentioning it now, the Chickasaw and the Cherokee were also people that were guilty of selling other Native American groups, including the Yamasee. The Yamasee were guilty of it also. But interestingly, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, and the Yamasee, all these peoples who were targeting other Native American groups, selling them, as slaves, they ended up being sold as slaves themselves. The Euro-Americans, the whites, just turned on them. And that's what's kind of interesting, kind of funny. It kind of reminds me of the dynamic that occurred in West Africa, West Central Africa, and Southern Africa during the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, the conquered were at once the conquerors, and oftentimes I can imagine like amidst slaves in the American South, people were looking at each other kind of funny, working alongside each other, because oftentimes the conquerors in West Africa, West Central Africa, Southern Africa became the conquered. Do you understand where I'm coming from? And the same thing happened with the Native Americans.